The morning mist clings to cobblestones slick with frost, as Lord Aldrich's golden banner cuts through the village square like a blade through silence. His destrier's hooves echo against stone walls that have witnessed 1,000 winters, yet none so cruel as this. A figure emerges from the shadows, a peasant girl with eyes that hold both desperation and dignity. She knows not that her next words will seal both their fates, nor that mercy, once scorned, shall return threefold when death stalks the thornwood. Will pride prove stronger than providence? Can a heart of stone learn to beat with compassion? Join us as we witness how a single act of humility in the face of cruelty reshapes the destiny of lord and peasant alike. This is a tale where honor is not born of blood, but forged in the crucible of mercy. The bells of St. Dunstan's Abbey rang 6 times through the bitter morning air, their bronze voices carrying across the frost-laden village of Millhaven like prayers made manifest. Each toll seemed to hang suspended in the crystalline atmosphere before dissolving into the grey tapestry of a sky that promised neither sun nor mercy. It was the feast day of St. Nicholas, yet few in this forgotten corner of the realm had cause for celebration. Mara pulled her threadbare woolen cloak tighter about her shoulders as she emerged from the hovel she shared with her ailing grandmother. The structure, if it could be called such, leaned against the village wall like a wounded soldier seeking support. Its thatch roof bore patches of moss and gaps that invited both rain and despair, while smoke from their meager fire struggled upward through a chimney built more of hope than stone. The village square stretched before her, a modest expanse of cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of carts, horses, and the endless trudging of those who worked the land. Around its perimeter stood the timber-framed dwellings of Millhaven's inhabitants, blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, and farmers who had known neither plenty nor peace in recent memory. The great mortality had swept through these lands 3 summers past, claiming near half their number, and those who remained struggled beneath the weight of taxes that seemed to multiply like locusts in a barren field. A commotion arose from the eastern approach, where the road wound down from Ravenscroft Keep, through stands of oak and elm that had stood sentinel since before memory began. Mara heard it first as a distant rumble, like thunder that could not decide whether to break or retreat. Then came the flash of color, banners of azure and gold bearing the raven emblem of House Ravencrest, followed by the metallic gleam of mail and the proud arch of destriers' necks. Lord Aldrich of Ravenscroft rode at the head of his retinue, resplendent upon a charger as black as midnight and twice as proud. His surcoat bore the family arms worked in threads of gold and silver, while his cloak fell in rich folds that had never known the touch of common weather. At 28 years, he possessed the bearing of one who had never questioned his place in the great ordering of things. His features, carved as if from marble by some master craftsman, might have been deemed handsome were they not set in lines of perpetual disdain. Behind him rode a dozen knights and men-at-arms, their equipment speaking of wealth and martial prowess that seemed to mock the poverty surrounding them. Their horses' breath steamed in the cold air, and their spurs rang against stirrups of polished steel. They moved through the village like conquerors, surveying a defeated realm, their eyes taking inventory of all they passed, but seeing nothing of true worth. The common folk of Millhaven emerged from their dwellings as they always did, when nobility passed through their midst, part curiosity, part obligation, and part desperate hope that some small favor might fall from the high table of privilege to sustain them through another harsh season. They lined the cobblestones with caps in hand and eyes downcast, offering the deference that custom demanded and survival required. Mara found herself drawn forward by an impulse she could neither name nor resist. In her apron pocket lay a small cloth bundle, her grandmother's silver thimble, the only item of value their family possessed. It had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before her, passed down through generations of women who had known hardship, but never surrendered hope. The plan that formed in her mind was born of desperation and seasoned with the kind of courage that only the truly desperate can summon. As the procession drew near, she stepped forward from the gathered crowd. Her movement was hesitant at first, like a fawn emerging from deep wood, but it grew bolder as necessity overcame fear. The cobblestones felt cold beneath her worn leather shoes, and she could hear her own heartbeat above the clatter of hooves and jingle of harness. "My lord," she called out, her voice carrying despite its tremor. The words seemed to hang in the air like drops of morning dew, fragile and easily dispersed. The procession slowed, then halted. Lord Aldrich's dark eyes found her among the crowd, and his expression shifted from mild curiosity to something approaching annoyance. His destrier pranced restlessly beneath him, sensing his rider's mood, while the assembled villagers held their collective breath. "My lord," Mara continued, gathering courage from some wellspring deep within her soul, "I beseech thee to hear a humble petition. My grandmother lies near death, and we lack coin for the physician's services. I offer this—" She withdrew the silver thimble from her pocket, holding it up so that it caught what pale light the winter morning provided. "In exchange for thy mercy and aid." A silence fell over the square that seemed to stretch like a bowstring drawn to its limit. So even the wind held its breath, as if nature itself awaited the Lord's response. The villagers watched with eyes that had seen too much sorrow to hope over much, yet could not quite abandon hope entirely. Lord Aldrich's lips curved in what might charitably be called a smile, though it held all the warmth of a blade fresh from the forge. When he spoke, his voice carried the educated tones of one schooled in Latin and courtly manners, yet wielded them like weapons against those he deemed beneath his station. "Dost thou mistake me for some merchant in the marketplace, girl?" His words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of unease among his retinue and the gathered crowd. "Think ye that the blood of ancient kings flows in these veins, to be bartered with trinkets fit only for a seamstress's basket?" The thimble seemed suddenly heavy in Mara's hand, its silver surface reflecting not light, but shadow. Around her, she felt the weight of watching eyes, some sympathetic, others merely curious to witness her humiliation. Her grandmother's teachings echoed in her memory. "Dignity, child, is the one treasure that none can take from thee, unless thou dost surrender it willingly." "I meant no offense, my lord," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. "I sought only—" Silence. The word cracked like a whip across the morning air. Lord Aldrich urged his destrier forward until the great beast loomed over her like a storm cloud pregnant with lightning. "Know thy place, peasant wench. The natural order places thee among the dirt and stones, not in discourse with thy betters. Return to thy hovel and trouble us no more with thy wailing." He turned to address his knights, his voice carrying easily across the square. "Mark well, good sirs, how the common folk forget the boundaries set by God and nature. Perhaps 'tis time their taxes were increased, that they might better remember their station in this life." Laughter rippled through the ranks of his retinue, not the honest mirth of men enjoying a jest, but the hollow sound of those who laugh because their lord expects it. The villagers shifted uncomfortably, knowing that such words, spoken in jest or earnest, often became harsh reality when next the tax collectors rode through their lands. Mara felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the morning's chill, yet she did not retreat. Something in her grandmother's teachings, in the silver thimble that represented generations of quiet strength, held her rooted to the cobblestones. She met Lord Aldrich's gaze directly, seeing in his dark eyes not malice precisely, but a coldness more complete than winter's embrace. "May God grant thee wisdom, my lord," she said quietly, her words meant not as curse, but as benediction, "and may he show thee the same mercy thou dost show others." With that, she turned and walked back through the crowd, her spine straight and her step measured. The silver thimble disappeared once more into her apron pocket, its weight somehow greater than before. Behind her, she heard Lord Aldrich bark orders for the procession to continue, his voice sharp with irritation at having his authority questioned, however gently, by one so far beneath his station. The crowd began to disperse as the last of the knights passed through the square, their colourful banners disappearing down the western road toward the market town of Ashford. The excitement faded like embers in a cold hearth, leaving only the familiar weight of daily struggle and the bitter taste of opportunity lost. Dawn broke grey and reluctant over the Thornwood, that ancient forest which stretched like a verdant sea from the borders of Millhaven to the distant mountains, where dragons were said to have made their lairs in ages past. The trees stood sentinel in the morning mist, oak and ash, elm and yew, their gnarled branches reaching toward a sky that seemed reluctant to shed its cloak of night. Frost clung to every twig and blade of grass, transforming the woodland into a crystal palace that would melt with the first strong ray of sun. Lord Aldrich had risen before the bells called the faithful to morning prayers, driven by a restlessness that wine and fine food could not ease. The previous day's encounter with the peasant girl had left him with an irritation he could not name, like a stone in his boot that made every step uncomfortable. Sleep had eluded him, filled as it was with dreams of accusing eyes and voices that spoke of mercy and wisdom. "Ready my hunting gear," he had commanded his chamberlain, a greying man named Godwin who had served the family since before Aldric's birth. "I would seek sport in the thornwood ere the day grows old." Godwin had hesitated, his weathered features creasing with concern. "My lord, perhaps it would be wiser to take a company of men-at-arms. The forest grows treacherous in winter, and there are reports of wolves." "I need no nursemaids," Aldric had snapped, his pride stung by the suggestion that he required protection in his own lands. "Have I not hunted these woods since I could sit a horse? Prepare what I command and speak no more of it." And so it was that Lord Aldric rode alone into the thornwood as the sun struggled to pierce the canopy above. His destrier, sure-footed despite the treacherous footing, picked its way along paths that deer and huntsmen had worn through countless seasons. The forest seemed to close around them like the pages of an ancient book, each step carrying them deeper into a realm where the rules of civilization held less sway than the older laws of survival and chance. The morning hunt began well enough. Aldric's hounds, 3 magnificent coursers bred for speed and stamina, soon picked up the scent of a great hart that had been leaving its mark upon the bark of ancient oaks. The chase led them through glades where wildflowers would bloom come spring, across streams that ran clear and cold as mountain air, and along ridges that offered glimpses of the world beyond the forest's embrace. But the thornwood was a jealous guardian of its secrets, and it did not suffer intrusion lightly. What began as sport gradually transformed into something darker as the paths grew narrower and the undergrowth more tangled. The hart they pursued seemed to lead them ever deeper into the forest's heart, where the trees grew so thick that noon resembled twilight, and the very air grew heavy with the weight of ages. It was near midday when disaster struck. The hart, cornered at last beside a cliff that dropped away into shadow, turned to face its pursuers with the desperate courage of the hunted. Aldric's destrier, startled by the sudden change from flight to confrontation, reared high upon its hind legs. The lord, caught off guard and leaning forward in anticipation of the kill, felt himself sliding backward in the saddle. Time seemed to slow as he fell, the world spinning around him like a child's top. He struck the ground with force enough to drive the breath from his lungs, his head connecting with a fallen log with a sound like an axe biting into seasoned wood. Pain exploded through his skull like lightning, and darkness rushed in from the edges of his vision like a tide that could not be turned. When consciousness returned, it came slowly and reluctantly, accompanied by a throbbing in his head that seemed to keep time with his heartbeat. Aldric found himself lying upon a bed of fallen leaves, the taste of blood copper-bright upon his tongue. His destrier was nowhere to be seen, likely having bolted for the safety of familiar paths when its master fell. The hounds, too, had vanished, perhaps still pursuing their quarry or perhaps seeking their own way home. He attempted to rise and immediately regretted the effort. The world spun sickeningly around him, and his left leg sent arrows of pain shooting up his spine when he tried to put weight upon it. A more careful examination revealed that his ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, likely twisted in the fall. Blood matted his dark hair where his head had struck the log, and his fine hunting clothes were torn and stained with earth and leaves. The silence of the deep forest pressed in around him like a living thing. No bird sang in these shadowed depths, no squirrel chattered from the safety of high branches. Even the wind seemed hesitant to disturb the ancient peace of this place. Aldric called out, his voice sounding thin and insignificant among the mighty trunks, but received no answer save the echo of his own desperation. As the short winter day began its descent toward darkness, fear crept into the Lord's heart, like cold water seeping through stone. He had always thought himself master of these lands, but now he understood with crystalline clarity that the forest recognized no human authority. Here he was not Lord Aldric of Ravenscroft, heir to ancient titles and vast estates. He was merely another creature struggling to survive, and not a particularly well-equipped one at that. The temperature began to drop as afternoon shadows lengthened into evening's embrace. Aldric's breath formed clouds in the increasingly frigid air, and he could feel the cold seeping through his clothing to settle in his bones. He tried again to stand, using a sturdy branch as a makeshift crutch, But his injured ankle would not bear his weight. Each attempt sent fresh waves of agony coursing through his leg, and he was forced to acknowledge that walking out of the forest was beyond his current capabilities. Night in the Thornwood was a different creature entirely from the civilized darkness that fell over castles and villages. Here the blackness was absolute, broken only by the faint gleam of stars visible through gaps in the canopy above. Strange sounds echoed from the depths of the forest, the hoot of hunting owls, the rustle of creatures moving through the undergrowth, and occasionally something that might have been the distant howl of wolves. Aldrich huddled against the base of a massive oak, its trunk providing some shelter from the wind that had begun to moan through the branches above. His stomach cramped with hunger, and his throat felt dry as parchment. He had brought no provisions, expecting to return to the castle before evening fell. Now, as the cold began to bite deeper and his strength slowly ebbed away, he found himself facing the possibility that he might never see another dawn. Pride, that quality which had always been his greatest asset in the games of court and nobility, now revealed itself as a deadly liability. Had he listened to Godwin's counsel and brought companions, he would even now be sitting before a warm fire, recounting the day's adventures over good wine and fine food. Instead, he was alone in a hostile wilderness, injured and helpless, with no one to mark his passing should the worst befall him. As the night deepened and the cold grew more insistent, Lord Aldrich's thoughts turned, perhaps inevitably, to the encounter in the village square. He remembered the peasant girl's eyes, bright with desperate hope, and her quiet dignity in the face of his cruel dismissal. Her final words echoed in his memory. "May God grant thee wisdom, my lord, and may he show thee the same mercy thou dost show others." The pre-dawn hours in the Thornwood were the coldest and darkest of all, when the very air seemed to crystallize with frost, and the ancient trees stood like silent witnesses to a world suspended between night and day. Lord Aldrich drifted in and out of fevered sleep, his body racked with shivers that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the bone-deep cold that had settled into his very marrow. His dreams were strange visions woven from guilt and memory. The peasant girl's face appeared again and again, sometimes accusing, sometimes sorrowful, always dignified. In his delirium, she seemed to move through the forest like a spirit of the wood, her worn cloak transformed into robes of silver light, her simple leather shoes making no sound upon the frost-covered earth. When he jerked awake, gasping and disoriented, he could almost believe he had seen her standing among the trees, watching him with those same clear eyes that had met his so fearlessly in the village square. The sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly, black giving way to the deepest blue, then to grey shot through with threads of pearl and gold. Somewhere in the canopy above, a single bird began to sing, a robin, perhaps, welcoming the return of light to a world that had seemed destined for eternal darkness. The sound was so pure and hopeful that it brought tears to Aldrich's eyes, though whether from relief or despair he could not say. It was then that he heard the footsteps. They came softly at first, barely distinguishable from the natural sounds of the forest awakening, the drip of condensation from pine needles, the rustle of small creatures beginning their daily search for sustenance. But gradually, they resolved into the unmistakable rhythm of human feet, picking their way carefully through the undergrowth. Aldrich's heart began to pound with a mixture of hope and terror. Rescue might be at hand, but in these lawless depths, not all who walked on two legs came with benevolent intent. A figure emerged from the morning mist like something conjured from dreams or prayers. Slender and sure-footed, despite the treacherous footing, wrapped in a cloak of rough-woven wool that seemed to blend with the shadows between the trees. For a moment, Aldrich thought his fevered mind had finally broken completely, for the figure approaching through the frost-laden ferns was unmistakably the peasant girl he had humiliated in the village square. Mara moved through the forest with the quiet confidence of one who had walked these paths since childhood, gathering herbs for her grandmother's remedies and deadfall wood for their meager fire. She carried a woven basket over one arm and a walking staff in her free hand, tools of survival that spoke of long familiarity with the forest's gifts and dangers. When she saw the figure huddled against the great oak's trunk, she paused for only a moment before approaching with the careful caution one might show a wounded animal, ready to help, but mindful that pain could make even the gentlest creature dangerous. "My lord," she said quietly, her voice carrying no trace of the triumph or satisfaction that Aldrich had expected. Instead, there was only concern and a kind of weary compassion that seemed far older than her years. "Thou art grievously hurt." Aldrich tried to speak, but his voice emerged as little more than a hoarse whisper. His throat felt raw, whether from the cold night air or from crying out in his delirium. He could not say. Mara set down her basket and approached closer, her movement slow and non-threatening, like a gentle healer approaching a fevered patient. "Peace, my lord," she murmured, seeing the wild look in his eyes. "I mean thee no harm. Indeed, I bring aid, if thou wilt accept it." She knelt beside him, her worn skirts spreading around her like the petals of some woodland flower. Up close, Aldrich could see that her hands, though roughened by work, moved with skilled precision as she examined his injuries. Her touch was gentle but sure as she probed the swollen ankle, checked the wound on his head, and assessed the extent of his condition. "The ankle is badly twisted but not broken," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "The head wound bleeds freely, but appears not to have cracked the skull. Thou art cold unto death, but thy heart beats strong." She looked directly into his eyes, and he saw there the same clear honesty that had marked her words in the village square. "Thou wilt live, my lord, if thou dost not surrender to despair." From her basket, she withdrew items that spoke of careful preparation: strips of clean linen, a small pot of some aromatic salve, dried herbs wrapped in oiled cloth, and a stoppered gourd that proved to contain water flavored with honey and strengthening herbs. With economical movements that wasted neither motion nor time, she set about tending his wounds. "Why?" The word escaped Aldrich's lips before he could stop it, carrying with it all the confusion and self-recrimination that had plagued his long night in the forest. "Why dost thou aid me? After yesterday, after what I said?" Mara continued her work without pause, binding his ankle with practiced skill while she considered his question. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "My grandmother taught me that mercy is not earned, my lord. 'Tis freely given, else it be not mercy at all." She secured the binding with a neat knot and moved to clean the blood from his hair. "She taught me also that every soul is precious in God's sight, be it housed in silk or sackcloth, born in castle or hovel." The salve she applied to his head wound carried the scent of healing herbs, comfrey and yarrow, chamomile and lavender. Its cool touch brought immediate relief from the throbbing pain that had plagued him through the night. As she worked, she continued speaking, her voice soft but clear in the morning stillness. "When I saw thy horse return to the village without its rider, I knew thou must be somewhere in the forest. The thornwood is vast and treacherous, but I have walked its paths since I was scarce higher than thy knee. My grandmother sent me to gather winterberry for her tisanes, but my true purpose was to find thee." "But I wronged thee," Aldrich whispered, shame making his voice thick. "I mocked thy petition, belittled thy station, threatened thy village with greater taxes. By what right do I claim thy aid?" Mara sat back on her heels, regarding him with those clear eyes that seemed to see through all pretense to the truth beneath. "By the right of thy humanity, my lord. Beneath thy fine clothes and proud words, thou art a man like any other, capable of pain, of fear, of regret. These things I see clearly, and they move me to compassion." She helped him sit more upright against the oak's trunk and offered him the gourd of honeyed water. The liquid was warm and strengthening, carrying with it the taste of hope and the promise of renewed strength. As he drank, she gathered dry wood and tinder from the forest floor, building a small fire with the skill of one who had done such work countless times. "There is more," she said as the flames began to catch and grow. "My grandmother lies dying, as I told thee yesterday, but in her fever she speaks of dreams and visions. She says the spirits of the wood whispered to her of a great lord who would be humbled in the forest's depths, and how mercy shown to him would return threefold to bless our village." The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up toward the canopy above. Its warmth began to drive the cold from Aldrich's bones, and with warmth came the return of hope. He studied Mara's face in the firelight, seeing there not the simple peasant girl he had dismissed so cruelly, but a young woman of remarkable strength and wisdom. As the sun climbed higher and the forest began to warm with the promise of day, Lord Aldrich felt something shifting within his heart, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. The journey back to civilization became a pilgrimage of transformation that neither lord nor peasant could have anticipated. Mara had fashioned a crude but effective crutch from a fallen branch, binding it with strips of cloth torn from her own cloak. She supported Aldrich's weight with surprising strength, her small frame proving more resilient than her appearance suggested. Together they made their slow way through the forest paths, stopping frequently to rest and allowing the Lord's strength to gradually return. As they walked, they talked, tentatively at first, then with growing openness. Aldrich found himself speaking of things he had never voiced to another soul: the loneliness of command, the weight of expectations placed upon him from birth, the way pride had become both armor and prison. Mara listened without judgment, occasionally offering observations that cut to the heart of matters with startling clarity. "My grandmother says that those who rule must serve," she said during one of their rest stops, as they shared bread from her basket beside a clear stream. "She says 'tis the hardest lesson for the mighty to learn, for they mistake dominion for freedom." "Thy grandmother speaks wisdom," Aldrich replied, his voice carrying none of the condescension that had marked his words the day before. "I fear I have confused authority with superiority, power with righteousness. The forest has taught me much about the difference between commanding respect and deserving it." They emerged from the thornwood near midday, the sight of open fields and distant buildings seeming almost miraculous after the close confines of the forest. Word of their approach spread quickly through Millhaven, and soon a crowd had gathered in the village square, the same space where their first encounter had taken place, now transformed by circumstance into something resembling an arena of redemption. Lord Aldrich's knights had been searching since dawn, their worry evident in their faces as they saw their lord supported by the very peasant girl he had scorned. Sir Marcus, his captain and closest friend since childhood, spurred his destrier forward with evident relief. "My lord, we feared the worst when thy horse returned without thee," he called out. "How came ye to be in company with my saviour?" Aldrich interrupted, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. The murmur that had been rising from the villagers died away into stunned silence. "This maiden found me in the forest's depths, broken and near death, and showed me mercy I had not earned, and kindness I had not deserved." He turned to face the gathered people of Millhaven, his nobles and knights on one side, the common folk on the other. The social divisions that had seemed so natural and necessary just 2 days before now appeared arbitrary and cruel in the light of recent revelation. "I stand before ye all as a man humbled by his own pride and elevated by another's grace," he continued, his words carrying the weight of genuine conviction. "Yesterday I turned away a petition for aid with scorn and threats. Today I proclaim that such cruelty shall have no place in my lands or in my heart." From the crowd, an old woman emerged, leaning heavily upon a walking stick carved from whitened bone. Despite her evident frailty, her eyes blazed with the fire of prophecy fulfilled. This was Mara's grandmother, risen from what all had thought was her deathbed to witness this moment of transformation. "The spirits of the wood spoke truly," she said, her voice thin, but carrying to every ear in the square. "They said a proud heart would be broken that it might be remade whole, and that mercy would beget mercy as surely as spring follows winter." Lord Aldrich approached the old woman, and to the amazement of all present, knelt before her in the manner of a knight receiving blessing from a holy relic. "Mother, thy wisdom exceeds that of all my counsellors, and thy granddaughter's virtue surpasses that of any lady at court. I beg thy forgiveness for my cruelty, and ask thy blessing upon the changes I would make." The old woman placed a gnarled hand upon his bowed head, her touch gentle despite the evident pain in her joints. "Rise, my lord, and be about thy work. There is much to be done if these lands are to flourish as they once did." What followed in the weeks and months that came after would be remembered as the Great Mercy of Ravenscroft. The village physician was summoned at Lord Aldrich's expense to tend not only to Mara's grandmother, but to all who had need of healing. The crushing taxes that had been bleeding the village dry were reduced to a fair tithe that allowed for both the Lord's needs and the people's survival. Grain from the castle's stores was distributed to those who faced hunger, and skilled craftsmen were brought in to repair the hovels that had been crumbling around their inhabitants. But perhaps most significantly, Mara herself was invited to serve as an advisor to the Lord, not in any formal capacity that would offend the sensibilities of court, but as one whose wisdom in matters of common welfare had proven itself invaluable. She moved between the castle and the village like a bridge spanning two worlds, carrying concerns upward and solutions downward with equal grace. Lord Aldrich's transformation did not go unnoticed by his peers among the nobility. Some mocked him for what they saw as weakness, claiming he had gone soft in his dealings with the peasantry. Others, however, began to take note of the prosperity that began to flourish in his lands as the common folk, no longer ground down by impossible burdens, found energy and motivation to improve their lot. Word of the changed lord spread beyond the borders of his own domain. Other nobles began to seek his counsel on matters of governance, curious about the methods that had turned a rebellious and sullen peasantry into a thriving and loyal population. Merchants began to favor the roads through Ravenscroft lands, knowing they would find fair treatment and honest dealing. On the first anniversary of their encounter in the forest, Lord Aldrich and Mara returned to the place where he had fallen. The great oak still stood sentinel over the spot, its branches now heavy with spring leaves that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns of gold and green. A small shrine had been erected there, not to any saint or martyr, but to the simple truth that mercy given freely will return to bless both giver and receiver. Years passed, and the tale of Lord Aldrich and Mara became legend throughout the realm. The transformation that began with a fall in the forest depths had rippled outward like stones cast into still water, touching lives in ways that neither lord nor peasant could have imagined. It proved that even in the darkest of times, when pride seemed triumphant and mercy appeared weak, the smallest act of kindness could kindle a flame that would illuminate an entire realm. And in the end, that perhaps was the greatest lesson of all. That the true measure of a life well lived lies not in the titles earned or the wealth accumulated, but in the mercy shown to those who have no claim upon our kindness save their common humanity. For in showing grace to others, we discover grace within ourselves, and in lifting up the fallen, we ourselves are raised to heights we never could have reached through pride alone.